We've all heard the term identity fabric, but what does it even mean? Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Austin, technical writer at KeyData Cyber. This week, I'm talking to Brian Reed, CTO at KeyData Cyber, to talk about how an identity fabric helps organizations be more efficient and secure. To start, for our listeners who might be new to the concept, can you explain what an identity fabric is?
Yeah, the term identity fabric was introduced by Coopinger-Cole about 8 years ago, and it's been adopted by a lot of different identity frameworks since. It's an approach to identity and access management that encourages organizations to integrate different types of IAM solutions into more of a unified and cohesive framework by getting them to talk to each other better. Organizations traditionally have had different identity silos, and you might recognize within your own organization access management, authentication, authorization solutions, privileged access management, identity governance. These are all different solutions that have been traditionally run by different groups and different products and very poorly tied together. So an identity fabric approach re-examines that and tries to get these tools to work better together or extend, uniform controls throughout your organization, start to break down these silos. So, a couple of other important points. Remember that identity fabric is an architectural approach. It's not just a single product. So, of course, you need to implement your identity fabric concepts with tools and products, depending on your organization's needs, but it's not a product-focused discussion. And then in really simple terms, just to summarize, traditional IAM is siloed and fragmented. Your identity fabric approach will connect the dots between all of these different silos and remove some of those barriers that are holding your organization back.
How does an identity fabric enhance security posture beyond traditional IAM? Could you give us some specific examples?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about identity silos a lot today, and that is a very common problem that a lot of the listeners will be able to identify with. When identity data is siloed across different areas of the organization, creates a bunch of issues that we've seen with our clients, and some of these might be recognizable to almost every one of our customers. Poor credential hygiene, meaning that users aren't properly offboarded, for example, leaving accounts with unnecessary or excessive permissions, and this can be a real security risk. Gaps in MFA and conditional access coverage. If you have multiple different sources for identities, you probably don't have the same level of control across all of those different identities. And you may find that things like MFA and conditional access are only implemented in some areas of your organization, but not others. Another security issue is, we see security incidents from user workarounds. So you've got these silos within your organization, and it creates a very complex environment for your users. They have multiple logins and multiple different MFA factors. This causes users to sort of come up with their own workarounds, and this introduces things like shadow IT or password sharing because they feel that they can't do their jobs in the most efficient way coming through all of these different controls if you're putting up these barriers. If you take a high-level approach and you just look at most modern cyber attacks, they're often identity-based. So, if we step back and look at the risk to the organization, attackers typically compromise an individual's account, and then they try and extend that access by gaining privileged access. This is the way that most modern attacks flow. And the concept of an identity fabric is all about consolidating, simplifying, and monitoring all of these different silos. And that reduces an attacker's ability to go after that weakest link. So through an identity fabric approach, you're dramatically reducing the risk to your entire organization by reducing their attack footprint, in addition to some of those, more smaller, more point examples that I gave.
So in simple terms, what dots are we connecting when we talk about building an identity fabric? What are the core components?
For connecting the dots, maybe I can illustrate this best with an example. So I'll take a few minutes to describe a typical organization. And then I'll talk about how KeyData would help the organization connect those dots, as you said. So let's take a typical organization. Maybe they have multiple IDPs. They might have AD, they might have Entra ID, they might have AWS, they might have some legacy IDPs like Red Hat Directory Server. And you know why? Because it's always been this way. And they're managed separately with separate provisioning and deprovisioning processes. Staff are getting onboarded and offboarded from some of them automatically, but other ones not so automatically. And of course, this creates a real inefficiency and insecure kind of situation. Let's say this organization also has different user accounts now for different areas of the organization. So users are faced with this kind of fragmented approach. It's a weak experience for them. They have multiple logins and multiple MFA factors. Let's say this organization also has a privileged access management solution that's running in its own silo. It's got its own administrators, it's got its own monitoring solution, and privileged actions are kind of self-contained within this other separate silo. And then, of course, every organization has legacy solutions, on-prem solutions that have grown up over the years. They've got everything, all the technical debt that most organizations have, technical duplication of accounts, dormant accounts, and general poor hygiene that comes from long-lived legacy solutions. So that's painting the picture of an organization that's got to this state by simply layering on more and more controls on top of their security gaps, addressing each gap as it comes up, as they identify it. And they've got a really fragmented organization now in the current state. So KeyData would approach this, with a more holistic view. We'd look at the architecture from the top down, and we'd consider more broad initiatives in line with an identity fabric best practice. So, take a step back and look at some of the things this organization could do better. Consolidating their IDPs would be one thing that comes to mind. Most organizations know how to connect Active Directory and Entra, and then after that, other IDPs are sort of treated outside of their core identity solutions. Integrating those and consolidating them potentially, in fact, removing unnecessary IDPs is the best path to victory in those areas. With fewer IDPs, it should be easier to implement some forms of SSO or conditional access. And this is going to result in a better user experience with fewer logins, higher security logins, and fewer MFA challenges. So standardizing on one of those IDPs, the most modern one with the most features, will give you some secondary benefits as well for improving the user experience. Now would also be a good time for the organization, while they're revamping their IDPs, to perform some identity hygiene, moving duplicate accounts and dormant accounts that have grown up over the years, taking their service accounts, making sure their service accounts all have owners, and generally cleaning up the ones that don't need to be in place anymore. The organization could also tile these dissimilar identity silos together with identity threat detection and response. We haven't talked that about yet, but ITDR, as it's known, are products and integrations that are purpose-built to detect and to respond to the threats posed by identity environments. So you've got your traditional SIEM solutions, which are general purpose threat detection and response. And a whole group of products has grown up around ITDR specific to identity threat detection and response. And then lastly, we'd encourage the organization to extend identity governance to all of their IDPs. So hopefully they'll have fewer IDPs, but for the ones that are remaining, we would want them to perform uniform onboarding, offboarding, and provisioning processes into them from a standard process and a standard tool set, just to tie everything together at that level. So I just rhymed off about 5 initiatives for this organization, and I understand that each of those initiatives is going to require, costing and resources. So we know that this won't happen overnight, but it's clear to see when you spell it all out, the way that these initiatives would work together, there would be a huge risk reduction to this organization in the future if they could just initiate some of these projects in the here and now. They may not even need new products. They might be able to leverage features of existing products. Issues can also be solved through existing automation, or they may be able to just solve some of these issues by simply implementing better standards and having people adhere to the standards and documenting these standards as well. So there's lots of different ways to solve this problem. It doesn't always have to cost lots of money and lots of new product, but addressing them in the here and now is really the most important hurdle to get across for these organizations.
So what advice would you give to organizations just starting their journey towards building an identity fabric? What are the biggest challenges they face?
KeyData helps organizations with their identity journey all the time. So we see different customers in different verticals and market segments. So this question is really salient to KeyData. The biggest challenge, in my opinion, that organizations face is simply recognizing the flaws in their current approach. That may sound easy, but we often come in to solve a particular problem, and the organization hasn't really stepped back and considered the root cause of the problem. To give you some examples, organizations typically have multiple IDPs, or they might stick with the outdated legacy solution simply because the disruption or the migration cost at that time might seem too high. There's often resistance to centralizing identity controls. This is something else that we see, particularly when it's politically difficult to remove tools from other teams. Centralization often is viewed as one group intruding on another group's area. And this has got us into the fragmented, sort of siloed identity architecture that a lot of organizations are in today, and creates a lot of long-term problems. So yes, you can solve some symptom of the root cause fairly quickly. However, it's really always best just take a step back and address the root cause, and find that getting organizations into this mindset is the hardest thing for them to do. So at KeyData, we really encourage organizations to step back and take a more holistic approach. So it might seem like more upfront work, for example, but consolidating and modernizing identity management systems leads to more streamlined processes, improved security, better longer-term security in general. At KeyData, we help clients align their identity strategies with business objectives, and this creates a more cohesive, scalable identity fabric that can adapt as their needs evolve. This gets organizations out of the cycle of solving symptoms of the identity problem with point solutions and not addressing the overall identity fabric that they're trying to implement.